Drangus here with my first video on the Game Train Sim Classic. This video will be the first in a series featuring tips and tricks for improving your route building skills in the simulator. I like to think of route building in this game as a lot like building a model layout in the real world, although it's not as messy, expensive, and confined by the availability of physical space. By the way, this series also assumes that you know the basics of track laying and other route building fundamentals, so if you don't, I recommend watching other videos on the subject first before you dive into this one. Here's a little bit of info about me. I've been building routes in Train Simulator since 2017. My first public route was 2018's Yatesmouth Branch Line, a GWR-themed fictional line set in England in the 1930s. I have a passion for railroading in the past, and being an American, I wanted to feature my home country's era of vintage railroading, which I felt was vastly underrepresented in Train Sim Classic. After working on several private projects for my own enjoyment, I decided to make a route for public release set in my home state of Illinois. This route is called the Iroquois Prairielands, and features 30 miles of the Illinois Central Railroad mainline. It's a solo build in progress, and is expected to be completed in spring of 2025. What you're seeing is footage from that route. It's the building of that route which led to my commissioning of the developer machine rail to build the Illinois Central 1923 Lima Mikado and Freight Pack, which was released on their website last year. Anyway, on to the video. Before we start building, let's do a little planning. Let's ask ourselves a few simple questions. Question 1. What is your goal for the route you're building? Think about what you want to achieve by making your route. Do you want to show off a historically significant railroading spot like Feather River Canyon or Horseshoe Curve? Do you want to make a route for a railroad or time period that is not yet represented in Train Sim Classic? Do you really need to make another Union Pacific route? For this specific route, my goal is to build an extremely simple fictional route that will showcase the techniques I use. In addition to this, the idea is to build a fun little route where people can drive their locomotives in quick drive for as long as they want, kind of like running trains on a model layout. Question 2. When will your route be set? Think about what period you are going for. It's one thing to have the appropriate rolling stock, but do you have period-appropriate signals, buildings, and automobiles also? For example, nothing sucks me out of the immersion of a route when I see a modern Ford pickup truck sitting in a route that's supposed to be set in the 1950s. On this route I'll be building in this video series, I'll be setting it during my favorite period of railroading history, the transition era of the late 40s and early 50s. For assets, I'll mainly be using the Boston and Albany route for its track rule and ground texture pack, as well as supplemental assets from the Bessemer and Lake Erie route and the Sacramento Northern route. All of these route asset packs are by the developer G-Tracks, who make some really great mid-20th century content which I use often. Question 3. Where does your route start and end? It's one thing to begin an extremely ambitious route project with hundreds of miles of tracks, but know that it takes a long time to build a well-detailed route. After all, no one wants to drive 100 miles through nothing but a few 2D trees and ground texture paint. If you are working alone, this can make your route build even more challenging, so choose your route building goals carefully and realistically. For example, I spend about a month working on one 5-mile stretch of route with roughly 800 meters of scenery on either side of the track with varying levels of detail depending on distance from the track and terrain features. That's a lot of time, especially for someone with a full-time job and a family like me, but I love this hobby, and it can be very rewarding when your work is finished, especially if you share it with the Train Sim community for others to enjoy and make scenarios for. Typically, when you are building a route based on one that exists or once existed in the real world, you'd want to use Google Maps overlays, Google Earth, decimal coordinates, imported digital elevation models, historic aerial photos, topographic maps, track charts, employee timetables, photographs, and more to accurately capture the route. Perhaps finding these resources is something I can talk about in a future video, but because this route will be fictional, this isn't very important. That being said, I have decided to set this little route in the central Midwestern United States, which is the general area of where I'm from, and imported a little bit of elevation data from that area for some variety in the track's gradient. Okay, let's start our route building with touching up our track's elevation. All I've done so far is lay this single track in a basic figure 8 shape. All of the track is at the same elevation, which means the overall grade is at 0%, which is not true even in areas as flat as the Midwest in which this fictitious route is supposed to be set. To make things a bit more interesting, I'm going to use the elevation tool to loosely contour the track to the terrain I've imported. We'll start at the diamond, the tracks of which must be at the same height for it to work properly. To adjust the track elevation at this intersecting point, I will select the 4 points I just created that surround the diamond, and move them together downward until the diamond is touching the ground. These 4 points are moved in tandem, so the rails and the diamond itself remain at the same elevation. Now I'm going to move out from the diamond and continue adjusting points on the tracks once every 100 to 200 meters or so to adjust the track height so it appears to be resting on the terrain. Instead of setting every single point of track elevation manually myself, I've highlighted the portions of the track I've adjusted, and then hit the Smooth Gradient button. Instead of the gradient suddenly changing all at once at one point on the track and possibly leading to a derailment, this tool creates its own elevation points and makes gradual transitions from one grade percent to another on your route. Do this with a few 100-meter chunks of track at a time, as if you select too much at once and then hit the button, it may crash the game and could lead you to lose any unsaved work, which is why I wish Dovetail games would implement an autosave feature. Notice the gentle rising and falling of the track, which looks very similar to what you'd see through a camera lens if you zoom in while pointing it down a set of railroad tracks. After we used the Smooth Gradient tool, some of the track may have risen above or sunk below the terrain, as we see here. In real life, railroads deal with this problem by making embankments and cuts for the tracks to run on and through respectively. In Train Sim Classic, we deal with it by using the Snap to Track tool. With this tool, you can set the angle of embankment and cut. Since we're in generally flat territory, we can set it at a shallow angle, which I consider to be anywhere from 5 to 30 degrees. I also set the width of the tool to 6 meters from the center of the track, so that the embankments and cuts aren't too wide or too thin. Notice how the terrain is now snapping to the track as I pass over it with the tool. If you are using this tool on a route set in an area of the world with extreme changes in elevation, such as in the mountains, you may want to set these angles higher to preserve the shape of the natural terrain. This tool isn't always perfect, especially if you've laid tracks with easements on the curves for higher running speeds like I have. You can go in with the height tool and make small terrain adjustments later if needed, as you can see me doing here. Okay, now that the track and terrain elevation has been taken care of, let's go back to that diamond of ours. I'll click the Weld tool, and a small box will appear above the point where the tracks cross. When I click it, this joins the tracks together and creates the diamond joint, flange-bearing frogs and all. To spice this route up a little bit, let's add a little more track to give drivers more options. We'll build a connecting piece of track to form a junction, ensuring that the Snap to Track box is checked so the rails connect, indicated by the pink highlighted box that appears when we hover over the track we want to connect to. We're not done yet though. Look how uneven the height is between the two tracks at this switch are, which makes the switch look messy and unrealistic. To fix this, let's adjust the height of the turnout so that it is exactly the same as the yellow elevation points on its neighboring track. We do this by creating new elevation points as seen here. That looks much better already. I now move to the switch apparatus itself, which in this case is an electric switch which would be controlled remotely in a tower or with a CTC board. I always make sure that the switch is, when possible, on the side of the track from which the turnout diverges. I then shift the switch apparatus to near the end of the diverging switch rail, and then adjust its height if need be. My rule of thumb is to do this procedure with every switch turnout, as switches are regularly interacted with by players on a route. To give whoever is running trains on this little route of ours the opportunity to add additional AI traffic, we're going to highlight an amount of track with the Alignment tool, and create a second main line. It's important to note that this second track will spawn as individual pieces of track, and will have to be joined together afterwards with the Weld tool, which is what I'm doing here. We'll now use the Crossover tool to connect the lines. The speed of your line will determine how long or short the siding should be. After we place the turnout, we delete any excess track, and join the rails together with the Weld tool. We then repeat the turnout adjustment steps that were shown earlier in this video. All of the track has been laid on this mini route, so it's now time to touch up our embankments and cuts. I select the Snap to Track tool, once again in the terrain menu, and do another pass over all of the track. When that's finished, it's time to begin some ground texture painting. We'll do a lot more of this on this route build in future videos, but for now we'll stick to the tracks. Our tracks look a bit too clean and neat as they sit on top of the grass texture. In the real world, track ballast doesn't neatly sit under the rails. It's messy and gets all around the track. We're going to use a ground texture paint that matches the ballast and paint around the track loft we've laid. I typically use a brush size of 15 for single track, and 25 for double track. I move the brush in little circles for a more organic look. Okay, so here's what we've completed so far. We laid the track, adjusted and smoothed its gradient, snapped the terrain to it by making embankments and cuts, and then tied it all together with some ground texture paint. This video reviewed and expanded upon some pretty basic concepts when it comes to route building in Train Sim Classic. In my next video, I'll get a bit deeper into some more advanced topics like signal placement and trackside infrastructure, which includes code lines, relay boxes, signal piping, towers, stations, industries, and more. Stay tuned. See you then.